who's made a career of advocating for common sense in government. And in his new book, he takes on the public sector unions representing police, teachers, and other government workers, arguing that they are not just an impediment to effective and accountable government, but may in fact be unconstitutional. Philip Howard joins me now. He's author of the new book, Not Accountable, Rethinking the Constitutionality of Public Employee Unions. Philip Howard, welcome. Good to see you.
Nice to be with you, Paul.
So explain for the audience the essential difference between public sector unions and private unions in the private economy, and why public unions are different and a different challenge for democracy.
Well, they're relatively new. They only got power in the 1960s. Nobody was noticing in the rights revolution. And the differences are really profound. First, the difference in leverage. In private union context, unions can't argue for inefficient work rules or practices because the company will go out of business or move out of town. Government can't move out of town. So public unions do nothing but argue for inefficient work practices in order to get more jobs and such. Same with the amount of money they're going for. In the private context, unions are fighting for a bigger split of the profit pie. There's no profit in government, so it's whatever the unions can get away with. But the biggest difference is how the negotiation works. And with private trade unions, collusion would be unlawful between management and some complicit workers group. In the public context, it's nothing but collusion. The public unions have massed their power to get friendly politicians elected, and then they sit down not on the other side of the bargaining table, but on the same side of the bargaining table and tell them what they owe them.
Right, so how that works is they take the dues money that they collect from workers, often it's usually coerced, and then they use that to elect the politicians who then who are supposed to be representing the public, but in fact are beholden to the unions. So
yes.
They're on both sides of the bargaining table.
So it's not a negotiation, it's a payoff. And we're not talking about like regular campaign contributions. We're talking about sometimes tens of millions of dollars in gubernatorial races where members of the public unions are staffing the headquarters of the gubernatorial candidate, in the recent case of the governor of New Jersey. They have busloads of union members manning the phone banks and doing door-to-door canvassing. I mean, they are a machine like no other political machine. So literally the candidates that are beholden to them.
I would argue that in the case of Illinois and some other states, and Albany, and to a certain extent in New York, they just run the government, essentially. They're de facto rulers. Now, you mentioned, interestingly, that this is relatively new. It came about in the 60s. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the former AFL-CIO leader George Meany, to name two, they thought that you should never have collective bargaining for public employee unions for some of the reasons you described. What changed in the 60s?
Well, there was the origin story is completely different than trade unions. It wasn't, people weren't being mangled in factories or, that sort of thing. No, the public employees, because of civil service, naturally organized into a voting bloc. And so the professional associations, that really what they were before the 60s, the people who ran them wanted more power. So they kept saying, it's not fair that we don't have collective bargaining rights and the workers in the private sector do. So eventually complicit politicians, who by the way were already getting a lot of campaign support from the unions, just went along and nobody really noticed.
For the reasons you describe, you argue in the book that electoral politics, normal electoral politics, can't solve this entrenchment problem. You want to go to the courts. What's the argument that they are unconstitutional?
There's a basic constitutional principle that someone who's elected can't delegate their governing authority to any private group.
That's in the Constitution, the non-delegation.
It's a non-delegation doctrine, and comes out of John Locke. Governing is a sacred trust given by the voters, and you've got to retain it. And that was reflected in a variety of places in the Constitution, but for state and local government, it's in something called the Guarantee Clause in Article 4, which states that the United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. And what that meant, according to James Madison, who talked about it a lot, was that whatever kind of democratic government the state chooses, the one thing that it must have is that the people elected must be directly accountable to voters.
Interesting. That's fascinating. So you're going to look for, I assume, a case to bring on this, and it's going to be fascinating to watch you do it. Thanks for coming in, Philip Howard. We have to take one more